Stemming from current events, the long-time issue of racial injustice is being highlighted in many different communities across our nation. And with this issue, you may have heard words being thrown around such as systematic racism and oppression. But do we know what these words actually mean? Professor of African American History and United States History Umeme Sababu of Edinburgh University gives us an in-depth explanation of some of these terms. The first one is racism.
Okay, it is a belief that whites are superior to people of color and accordingly are treated in such a manner. It also is related to the historical existence of slavery, where we find race was utilized as a means of justification to enslave Africans. It's primarily a term that's used in the West, in the Western world, to discuss our relationship to the so-called Western world, that is Europeans, okay? And we can date this back about 500 years ago when slavery began in the Western Hemisphere. So this term racism is not only a term that defines African Americans' relationship to whites in this country, but it's a term also that can be applied to the Western world, whether it's in Brazil, or whether it's in Mexico, or whether it's in the Bahamas, or whether it's in the Dominican Republic, or even in the Eastern world, where in England and in France, we also can see this ideal of race in and of itself. One of the things that many people don't know is that the term race itself really has no biological meaning. There's no such thing as race. So this is a socially constructed ideal to divide and to control people of color. So we tend to talk about race in American society. And when people come here from other countries, from China or Japan or any Asian country, one of the things they first notice is how race is such an explosive term in American society. In fact, when I think about America, what I first think about is race. I don't think about Christopher Columbus. I don't think about the Pilgrims, but I think about how this country was built on the backs of African Americans and Africans, and we can see the beginning of the ideal of racism, even though there was no term for racism in the 16th and 17th century, but the practice of that, the ideal somehow that Africans or the descendants of Africans were inferior to particularly the English who came here in 1607.
The next word is prejudice.
Prejudice is simply to prejudge a person without any prior knowledge or contact with another person. And we see this particularly in the media, people who have had no intimate contact with African Americans, somehow these ideals of superiority is instilled in individuals who have never had any intimate contact with individuals. For example, we have parents who would say that they're not necessarily racist, okay, who say they're not prejudiced. But in terms of what they do, what they say around kids, provides in kids the prejudgment of African Americans. And it's done in a number of ways. It could be a feeling, a stereotype, a belief, or a tendency to discriminate against members of a group they know nothing about. So most whites who have no intimate contact with African Americans will believe that blacks commit more crime, that blacks are poor, they're lazy, etc. With no prior knowledge, for example, that we built this country. How can you be lazy and build a country? So it's really prejudging, and most people who live in rural areas, like Pennsylvania, their first contact with African Americans is usually in college. One of the programs that we had, the partnership program, what we were trying to do was to bring people from Cockerton, from Meadville, and then from Erie, who would never probably would meet at all, and bring them together in one common area so that they can understand each other. And what we found out was that young people had the same beliefs, same ideals, same struggles, same goals. So we tried to break down that prejudging of people of color. When people of different ethnic groups or racist groups or racial groups got married from the partnership program to people who were in the partnership program, which never would have happened, 50 years ago. So I think that when you don't have intimate contact and don't research for yourself in terms of what a person or people are like, then you have this prejudging of people who you really had no prior knowledge to their history or their being itself.
Systematic racism.
Okay, it is a practice and policies that are inherent in this society. Okay, it refers to the rules, the practices, the customs that are rooted in law. Okay, in laws. These may have changed over time. Okay, there's no longer signs that say segregation, whites here and blacks here. There are no longer signs that says colored here, white here. But in terms of the customs that exist, the ideal of so-called equality, that still is a problem in this particular country. For example, it's a term called redlining. Redlining is a multifaceted practice of denying financial government services to people who are buying homes. At one time, you couldn't buy a home I think it was called in Glendale. Blacks could not buy a home in Glendale. It was in the covenants that you couldn't sell a home to a black person. Okay? There are other areas in this country where it was illegal to sell a home to an African American. That's an example of this institutional racism whereby there's no laws. They don't say a sign, you can't buy a home here, but you won't get a loan for that area. You won't get financial assistance for that area. For example, I was given an apartment, and the lady told me, she says, well, you have to make, let's say, $40,000 to live in this neighborhood. And I'm like, why would I even look for a house or apartment if I don't make $40,000? Why would you assume that I don't know that I need $40,000 as income to get this apartment, even without knowing me, not asking me where did I work or whatever. So that's an example of institutional racism.
It's microaggression.
Okay, microaggression is all of the systems, all of the institutions that when you tie them together, it's like a spider web, okay? Where in fact that despite who you may be as a person of color, that you are affected by the institutions that are connected together, like workplaces, universities, stores. These are things that are tied together that strengthens the whole notion of racism and the whole notion of discrimination.
White fragility.
This is the discomfort and defensiveness on the part of white persons who are confronted by information about racial equality and injustice. You'll mention that racism exists, and they'll say, "Oh, it doesn't exist. It's not like that." Or my family came here from Ireland, and they worked hard, and now they're successful. So it's a way where they feel uncomfortable and defensive about talking about the issue of racism and discrimination.
Structural racism.
Structural racism, the term really refers to public policies, okay, and institutional practices and cultural representations and other norms at work in our society. Examples: public policies. From 1896 to 1954, a ruling by the Supreme Court stated that segregation was legal in the United States. That's a law. A structural law, not just in the South, in the entire United States, segregation was legal. That's a structure that was set up And it's a structure that, although does not exist anymore in terms of on paper, it still exists in the common practices in the United States. Like, for example, in Erie, Pennsylvania, if you drive from Harbor Creek to Fairview, just on that street, you got Harbor Creek High School, you have, forgot the name now, Harbor Creek High School, then you had East High, then you had Strong Vincent, then you go out to the suburbs, then you have Fairview. Now compare those schools in terms of facilities that exist. Compare the streets in terms of how they're paved or not paved from Harbor Creek to Fairview. That's in the structural society. The institutional practices are universities who fail to hire people of color, Latinos and African Americans, by saying, we can't find any qualified African Americans or Latinos. This is 2020. You can't find any? And then, again, structure, our hairstyles. You got companies who have said you can't wear cornrows, you can't wear braids. You know, there was one place, there was a wrestling match. Right before the wrestling match took place, the lady, he had to cut his cornrows off. So what does that mean? That you have a problem with our hairstyles, but yet whites can come in with long hair, males, long hair, stringy hair, etc., or with their hair in colors, and there's no issue itself. So that's the structural problems that we have here.
White privilege.
That's related to white fragility, okay? It refers to the historical and contemporary advantages and access to quality education and decent jobs and livable wages, home ownership, retirement benefits, wealth, and so on. White privilege exists regardless of that person's socioeconomic status, whether they're poor, middle class, or upper class. An example of that is the young lady who was in the park, and the guy was bird watching birds. And she got upset and told him to get out the park, and he didn't get out, and you can't do that. And then she said, I'm gonna call the police and tell her you're harassing a white woman and a dog. How did she come to the field that she's in the wrong, but feel she could call the police and say that a black man is harassing a white woman? You may be too young to remember this. There was a lady by the name of Susan Smith in South Carolina. She said she had been killed. She said that a black man had carjacked her car and took her kids. A black man in South Carolina taking two white kids riding in South Carolina. And that she couldn't find him. The whole city, the whole county, looking for this black man who had carjacked her with these two white kids, found out that she had driven her kids into the lake. Another case in Boston in a neighborhood called Roxbury. Charles Stewart. He called the police and said he had been robbed by a black man, and he shot my wife. They looked for him and all that, couldn't find it. Then his brother felt guilty about it and said Charles Stewart lied and he killed his own wife. But just by calling a person on a black person, that's white privilege, where you feel that you have an advantage despite how poor you are, how middle class you are, or upper class, that you feel that you have a advantage, okay, or privilege, etc.
It's oppression.
Oppression is the systematic and institutional abuse of power that has existed in this country since we arrived. Okay, it is to maintain control over people of color. It is an oppressive system that's built around the ideology of white superiority. We can go back in history to see this oppressive system that was devised, ironically, devised not when the nation first started. A lot of people are unaware of this. When we first came here, we were not enslaved persons. 1619, we were similar to other whites. We were indentured servants, and indentured servants, they worked 7 years, and then they would be freed, and then they would get some labor, they would get some tools, and go on and find their land. We were just like that. But in 1641, 3 indentured servants ran away. 2 white, 1 black. The 2 whites, their service was extended 3 or 4 more years. But the black, he was indentured servant for life. 1641. Okay. Then they start seeing what was going on in the Caribbean. Caribbean sugar, they had sugar plantations. They were getting very wealthy off the backs of blacks. Again, oppression.
Minority.
It's a term that I reject. It's a term that refers to people of color who are in the numerical minority. I look at it like that, as a numerical minority, because if you look globally, people of color, we are the most people in the world, people of color. But that status of minority also connotates less than, marginalized, with other negative terms. So I reject using the term minority. And when I do utilize it, I mention it as a numerical term. Because what would happen in 2050 when whites will be the numerical minority? Will they refer to themselves as the minority when the country will be mostly Latina and African Americans? Then will they refer to themselves as minority?
White supremacy.
White supremacy is a more extensive nature of racism. White supremacy means that whites are supreme in all of the life, every institution, medicine, teaching, that's what that means. It's not just the practice of discrimination and prejudice and all of that. It means that they are superior, biologically superior to people of color.
Okay, perfect. And the last one I have on here is Black Lives Matter. It's more of a phrase rather than a term.
Yeah, but the history of that, most people don't know. It's so important to do research on these things. It was started by 3 black women in 2013. They created this term that was black-centered, about politics and the movement to build a more just society. And it took place after the Trayvon Martin's murder, okay, in 2013. Now it has come and rise to be that our lives, black lives, matter. And it always has mattered. But what has happened in this country is that some have attempted to take our humanity away. It is an affirmation, Black Lives Matter, an affirmation that black folks and black people are human, and our contribution in the society and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression cannot be denied. You remember the case with Dylan Roof? Dylan Roof was the young man who went into the church in South Carolina and shot nine black people in that church, okay? And then they found his car. His car was driving down the street. They found out who he was. The police went up to the car. They had their hands on the guns. When they got to the car and saw he was a white boy, they put their guns back in the holster. Then arrested him and took him to Burger King to get something to eat. Then you had James Holmes. You may not recall, this was 2012. He was calling himself the Joker. He went into a theater, shot like 13 people. He came out the theater, they were there, arrested him. He then shot 12 people, had assault rifles, arrested. In Pennsylvania, there was a white guy by the name of Eric Fain. He shot 2 state police troopers. One died, the other didn't. They went for a hunt. He was in the forest. He was captured. They brought him. Now he's in jail. Come on. But a man can have a $20 bill, a $20 fake bill, and you have to put your knee on his neck for a $20 counterfeit $20 bill? Or you are selling illegal cigarettes and you're choked to death? Or you're jogging down the street and you're shot to death? Or you're sleeping in your apartment, and you're shot to death? Or the one lady who was playing with her niece and the police bust in and shoot her through the window? Then you had James Holmes. You may not recall, this was 2012. He was calling himself the Joker. He went into a theater, shot like 13 people. He came out the theater, they were there, arrested him. He then shot 9 to 12 people, had assault rifles, arrested. In Pennsylvania, there was a white guy by the name of Eric Fain. He shot 2 state police troopers. One died, the other didn't. They went for a hunt. He was in the forest. He was captured. They brought him. Now he's in jail. Come on. But a man can have a $20 bill, a $20 fake bill, and you have to put your knee on his neck for a $20 counterfeit $20 bill? Or you are selling illegal cigarettes and you're choked to death? Or you're jogging down the street and you're shot to death? Or you're sleeping in your apartment, and you're shot to death? Or the one lady who was playing with her niece and the police bust in and shoot her through the window? Or the other white lady who said she was in the wrong apartment. She thought she was in her apartment and then went in and shot the guy to death? So these types of things are why the system exists, what we're going through right now. We are tired of the studies and the commissions, and we want to study the problem and come with recommendations and talk about it. We need to talk about it. We're tired of that. We've been talking about it for 400 years. And we've had studies and commissions and recommendations. Now it's the time for action, and we're on the cusp of hopefully having some real changes so that the words that we hold these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as truth, and not just on paper. And Dr. King said, all we want you to do is live up to what you put on paper. All men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just live up to that.